Tenant advocates are trying to have the city adopt new protections for people at risk of displacement. Their goal is to require just cause for eviction, with more efforts to make sure tenants know their rights. But the proposal is meeting resistance from property owner groups who say it will have a chilling effect on housing production and rehabilitation. Tonight we hear the perspective from one of those groups, the Small Property Owners Association. We'd like to welcome its Executive Director, Skip Schloming. Thank you very much for being with us, Skip.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
You have to admit, just cause eviction sounds pretty reasonable, but what's unreasonable?
Well, you need to look at what the just causes are, and they're very limited. And I won't detail them. They're just 8 specific just causes that allow eviction. But they don't include eviction for rehabilitating the property or renovating it. They don't include eviction for making a condo conversion, which would also involve renovating it. And they don't even make a just cause be to bring a very low rent up to market level. So the idea is to indirectly control rents and keep them low and keep tenants in their place. And one of the low rents are a serious concern, and even the fact that you can't evict a tenant that may not quite come to the level of a just cause, but is a tenant that's for a long time been bothering you in some way, that is blocked. And we think that that means that owners really will lose control over their tenants, and eviction is a form of social control that ideally isn't used very much at all, but if it's there, tenants respect it. I mean, we have no problem with our tenants, but if there were, for example, with my wife and myself, but if there were a problem, we would address that. So we have no problem with them. But behind it is the idea that if you do something bad, you might be evicted, and it will affect your record for getting future housing.
Well, one situation we've been seeing lately is you have properties maybe not in the best of shape they haven't changed hands in a long time. A new buyer comes in, wants to raise the rents substantially, and they need to pay the mortgage. So if the tenants can't handle that, isn't that going to set up a just cause for which they can be evicted, at least after a month or two, or even a few months maybe?
No. There's at least in the proposal that we have had, that's not a just cause. There's a very limited things. It's like being not disrespectful, being destroying the disturbance of other tenants, not paying your rent, habitually not paying it, not just occasionally not paying it, but habitually not paying it, which is a bothersome term to me, not following a term of the lease. It's all fairly technical reasons, none relating to the upkeep of the housing. And that's what our concern is. If you block renovation, even of a small nature, and block condo conversion, you're not letting the housing be rebuilt, renovated, resurrected for a much longer period of time. If you don't do it, the housing that's being effectively rent controlled just slides downhill and downhill and downhill, and eventually you have to bulldoze it.
Well, we'll break it down a bit. Suppose you have a new owner comes in, the tenant before was paying $1,100 a month rent, and the new owner says, look, this has got to go up to $2,100, and the tenant doesn't pay it. So I mean, if that amount isn't paid, why isn't it a just cause?
It isn't. It isn't. They don't want tenants to be evicted in any way. And one of the most common reasons, I mean, your example is an exaggerated example, because if an owner just doesn't do anything to the unit and raises it from $1,100 to $2,100, the tenant may have to leave if the owner's not reasonable. But there's not going to be any other tenant that's going to come in and take that place if the value of the apartment is truly around $1,100, or even, let's say it's below market rent, but say $1,400 would be, a more reasonable rent. Maybe at that rent it can be rented, but that's the way the market works. Is that there are limits on what landlords can do, and there are very real limits in terms of raising rents. The one thing that is most common that the tenant advocates are concerned about is when an owner comes in, it's an older property, it's not in great shape, they evict evict all the tenants, and then they renovate completely, and they either rent it for much higher rents, in the 2,100 range, say, or they sell them as higher end condos, which are always in pretty slick condition when they're first sold. So it's that kind of thing that we think needs to happen in the city, and you can't put control on all the housing, or not all the rental housing, but most, from 60 to 80% of the rental housing would be covered by this just cause eviction proposal, and that's just way too much. They're trying to stop this kind of condo conversion where supposedly big corporate developers take over, but that's a small phenomenon. I suspect it's occurring to less than 5% of the rental housing. So why do they want to put just cause eviction on 60 to 80%? The reason doesn't have to do with the good it might do to tenants, because in fact getting in an eviction battle with your landlord is a bad mark on your resume for new housing. So we think you can't have that broad base of concern. There are ways of dealing with the problem of tenant displacement, and I'm not denying that there is a legitimate concern that they're talking about, but it doesn't, as I say, it's not nearly as broad as they would have this apply. And tenants who are being displaced need to be able to have assistance in negotiating with their landlord for more time, perhaps, because a 30-day notice is awfully fast for someone to make a decent decision. They need relocation assistance because they don't necessarily know where they're to go. There's a new book out called Evicted, recently published, very well researched, reviewed, and it says tenants who are not thinking about eviction happening to them say, well, if they were evicted, they'd find a new home. But when they're actually in the throes of an eviction, they absolutely have no clue where they're going to go. So again, help in relocation. And then it can be, according to this book of Evicted, and I believe it, I'm a sociologist, I believe it, there is a psychological trauma to being evicted. And I think tenants in this situation, and it's a small group, the city should be providing services like, such as a social worker would supply to a tenant or client of theirs, which is help, for example, in keeping your old relationships going, getting new relationships in the new community, helping in that, keeping a person's self-esteem up. These are things that, for people that are in already in lower income levels, maybe struggling in other ways as well, and this is a way to get them some help.
Well, the way this is drafted so far, it would exempt a lot of these smaller multifamily buildings if the owner lives in one of those units. Right.
It exempts up to 5 units, anywhere in the city actually, if the owner lives in one of those units. So condos can be spread out, and they could still, it's under 5, but if it's not under 5, see, under 5 doesn't eliminate all of the smaller properties, not by a long shot.
Not the 6 families.
There are plenty of 6 families and up. Owners who own that size can have much smaller units, 2 and 3 family properties that are small properties, and maybe sold off at some time to an owner occupant or whatever, and those properties would be affected too.
But wouldn't the city still have some advantage in this kind of a setup? Because it's one of those mantras we keep hearing from city government for a long time. It's great to have owner occupants in these multifamily buildings. It stabilizes the neighborhood. So isn't that a good thing?
Sure, I think owner occupancy is an absolutely fine thing, and it does help the neighborhoods, but actually well more than half of the 2-family and 3-family properties are absentee owned. So it still has, I think, a good potential for community amongst those tenants, and owners that don't need to live right on the property to take good care of that property. So, and to be concerned about the neighborhood. They don't want a neighboring house, becoming a wreck. Everyone wants to keep the neighborhood in good shape, including the owner, even if it's an owner living elsewhere in the city, or even if it's an owner, it's actually only a Boston resident can live in the properties. If your first home is outside the city limits, all of your properties in Boston would be under the control of this ordinance.
What about the overall effect on new housing construction you see from this?
It ends it. It ends it. Rent control, which is at bottom line, is what this is. Even if it exempts new construction, always stops the developers from coming in and the investors from coming in. They figure that they're taking a big chance that this regime would be imposed on them. And there is no exemption in this current proposal for new construction. So it would apply to all larger buildings completely. All of them would become under rent. It just stops.
Now, that does seem to be a pretty much of a stretch here. I mean, there are some other cities that have restrictions that we don't have in Boston, and they have plenty of construction, gentrification. What about San Francisco?
No. San Francisco is having very little new construction, is my understanding, because the rent control doesn't make it a good prospect. They may be having, affordable housing, which is definitely exempted. Subsidized housing, that may be being built. But my understanding is no, it's in any jurisdiction that has rent control, it stops it. It kind of freezes the housing and gradually, eventually lets it expire in its use because it's not being maintained, it's not being updated.
I have to admit, when I see tenants digging in against a rent increase, I see people with few or no other options. Do you think tenants are going to be the same way if there's somebody in a high-rise near the waterfront? People who have other options and might say, I'm not going to fight this, I'm just going to move.
Right.
I mean, won't they just
It would be a different situation in a larger building, I'm sure, for more affluent tenants. So that wouldn't be a serious problem. But again, a rent increase that's voluntary on the part of an owner of a large building is not likely to get too far out of whack. If it does, then you go. But most owners of bigger buildings are very savvy to what the market is and how much they can reasonably charge for their properties.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Skip Schloming from the Small Property Owners Association.
Thank you.
We'll have more news in just a moment.